dive in. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's discussion between Robin Hahnel and Ferdia O'Brien about Hahnel's new book, A Participatory Economy. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina. We're a queer feminist anarchist collective that specializes in titles related to feminism and queerness and social movements and radical politics. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, due to the ongoing pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. Next week, we're hosting author David Camfield in conversation with activist and organizer Cynthia Kaufman about Camfield's new book, Future on Fire, Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change. So if you're interested in signing up for those or any other events happening through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. For those of you who are here tonight and in the live audience, tonight's speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll just encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom. Well, great. Moving on to tonight's speakers here to discuss a participatory economy. Robin Hahnel is a lifelong radical activist and economist whose work emphasizes environmental sustainability and is best known for his work on alternatives to capitalism. His books include Democratic Economic Planning, The ABCs of Political Economy, and Economic Justice and Democracy. Ferdia O'Brien is the host of After the Oligarchy, a political economy podcast dedicated to exploring deep solutions to humanity's problem. He lives in Ireland and is a founding member of the Democracy in Europe's Movement's Post-Capitalism Collective. So Robin, Ferdia, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Ferdia.
So thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. And before we begin, I'd just like to thank Firestorm Books for organizing this event and having the vision to do so. And I'm not saying that to plumb us or to adulate, but these are this topic of post-capitalist vision, detailed vision, is something that isn't discussed enough. So I'm very glad that you have organized this. So we're going to talk today about Professor Hahnel's new book, A Participatory Economy, and the model of post-capitalism presented within that. And we're going to give an overview of that. So if you aren't familiar with the participatory economy, then you're in for a real treat, because you will understand the essentials at the end. But before we get into that, Professor Hahnel, Democratic Economic Planning, your previous book, was published in 2021. Why did you write this book, A Participatory Economy, released on October 4th, just past?
Well, really what had happened was this. I mean, I have been writing about a model of a participatory economy as an alternative to capitalism, also as an alternative to centrally planned socialism, sort of the 20th century socialism, and also as an alternative to various versions of market socialism that are out there. So I've been writing about this, for going on 30 or 40 years now. But one of the things that had happened was that for the first time, we were sort of tackling new subjects that we had not previously addressed. And so we wanted to get our ideas on these new subjects out there. And when we did that, what we realized is, well, there's really two different audiences that we really wanted to address. We wanted to address economists who essentially insist on certain kinds of questions that be answered in certain kinds of ways. So we wanted to go ahead and address people with serious economic training, economic professors, economic graduate students. And that doesn't mean that somebody else who's not an economist couldn't read that book, but there were a lot of parts of that book that were primarily oriented toward people who have economic background. And then we realized, well, that makes that book rather forbidding and unacceptable to a much larger audience. Because if you ask yourself, how large is the audience of economists who are interested, seriously interested in any sort of detailed evaluation of alternatives to capitalism, it's a very small group. On the other hand, throughout the world and even in the United States over the past dozen years, primarily thanks to Bernie Sanders, there are now a large number of young people who, when asked, will say, well, I think I kind of like the idea of some sort of socialism rather than capitalism. So that's a much larger audience, but we wanted to write a book that essentially presented the ideas, but not in the kind of way that an economist would insist on. So that was the reason for writing both and putting both books out there pretty much as soon as we could.
So a participatory economy, it covers the same material. So it's the most up-to-date version of a participatory economy, but in a more accessible form, which more people, for example, activists, will find, easy to read, basically.
And both of them address subjects we had not really addressed before: investment and investment planning, environmental planning, international economic planning and international economic relations, and we can call it reproductive activity or reproductive labor, the subject that is of great interest to feminists and socialist feminists. We had really not tried to address those issues in the past. And I want to say that for that reason, there are parts of what is in this book that I feel have been pretty well vetted. I mean, they've been out there for decades. There have been all sorts of journal articles where people have said, we like this part, not that part, answers back and forth. And the new material is much less vetted. And so in some ways, the new material we are more hesitant about. We're saying, well, we think these are good answers to these questions that weren't addressed before, but we're very interested in hearing what reactions people have.
Good. So moving on to some more substantive discussion, let's not dive immediately into the participatory economy model and just take a view from above and talk about post-capitalist vision in general. So Professor Hahnel, you've worked assiduously over literally decades to articulate a vision of a better society and more broadly to develop the theory of post-capitalism in a very precise and thorough way. So clearly you think that this is very important, yet it remains an unusual practice on the left. So why is it so important to thoroughly investigate society after capitalism, to envisage post-capitalism in this thorough way, and how thorough should we aspire to be?
I think the first reason is that if you go back to the early 1900s, go back to just before 1914, I think most socialists thought that once capitalism was overthrown, that it would be fairly obvious how to proceed. And I think it's turned out that it's not nearly as obvious as people once believed. Now, on top of that, we then had, the experience of real world existing socialism in the Soviet Union and then later in Eastern Europe and China. And if that is clearly not what we are proposing, then there now is a new burden, that's placed on people who are still proposing socialism as an alternative to capitalism, which is, well, you have to explain to us what it is that you're proposing and how it's different from that. If that's not what you're proposing, then how is it different? So I think people have every right at this point in history to want to know concretely how it is that people who are opposed to capitalism and want to replace it with a different economic system, how is it that they would propose that all the different kinds of decisions that have to be made in any economy should be made, and why they should be made that way? So that's the reason we think that it's incumbent upon those of us who are anti-capitalist to do something more than to just present a vision of a better economy. I think that at this point in time, people want more than just broad generalities of what we imagine would be nice. And they have good reason to believe that it might be problematic, and therefore there should be some serious thinking about it. So that's the overall, I think that's why it is that amongst all the other work that leftists have to do, to try and right the wrongs of the world and build revolutionary movements, et cetera, that one of the tasks that lies before us, is to have a much more serious debate and discussion about what it is that we want. And it turns out in the aftermath of the collapse of communism by 1990, that there is a lot of disagreement out there. There are various schools of thought that have very different answers to that question. So it's not just that we owe people, a more thorough answer. The honest truth is that there is a considerable amount of disagreement amongst anti-capitalists about what it is that they would like to see in its place. So that's another reason there's no avoiding the debate and the discussion.
Yeah, we could talk about this all day. We're not going to, fortunately, but just to add something, I've been thinking about this, and I think one reason, which is obvious, is that it really takes time. This better than anybody. It takes time to actually debate and develop these models and proposals, and for other people to criticize them and for revisions to be made and so forth. And if we think about people's participation in constructing a new society, something I think is, if you imagine a revolutionary moment, if we want to reach a point where these ideas become widespread and a wide section of the population has actually had an opportunity to vet them and give their opinion on it. After all, we want to create a society that works for everybody and not just a minority of intellectuals. Then we really need to do the work now to put these things forward and to debate them and so forth. But why do you think that it is actually to this day so uncommon to do that on the left?
There's a good reason that it's uncommon, and that is that there's all sorts of other more pressing tasks that we need to occupy our time and energy, like avoiding fascism in the United States, in less than 30 days. And, fighting for various, reforms that, and essentially, so there's plenty of other things that occupy our time. And I'm not proposing that those things are not important to do, but I do think that it means that this is easy to neglect. But I think that now we have seen, one of the things history has proved to us is neglecting this is dangerous. Neglecting this is dangerous. And a lot more thought needs to go into it, if we are If when we are successful at having opportunities to replace capitalism with something different, if we don't want to fail, yet again, then we have to be much better prepared. And this is basically just about doing the hard work of getting better prepared, thinking it through more carefully, and spending some time doing that, identifying that as one task that the left needs to tackle more seriously than we have in the past. I want to add one last thing, which is, but it's important to do that. I mean, it's important. You can be thorough but humble. It's not like we're trying to dictate to people who have overthrown capitalism what they have to do. I mean, that's absurd. Spending time thinking about things and arguing about things and trying to flesh out the pros and cons of doing things in one way rather than another, that's not the same as saying we sitting here are going to dictate to what people who overthrow capitalism have to do when they do it the next time. Of course, they're going to decide how to go about it. It's a question of whether trying to do something that will better help them prepare to build the kind of society they really wanted when they were overthrowing capitalism.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so enough teasing. Let's get into participatory economy. Let's now turn to the vision expounded in your latest book, A Participatory Economy. But before we consider any part in depth, I'd like to give viewers a sense of the whole system so that they can make sense of what comes later. So could you briefly describe the aspirations which animate this vision? That's to say, what kind of society is a participatory economy supposed to create before we get into the details?
Right. From the very beginning of trying to think this through, our approach always was, well, you have to start out with your goals. Talking about creating an economy that achieves something, well, it's important to get clear about what is it you're trying to achieve? What are the goals that you're trying to fulfill? And I'll give a very brief description of them. And one of the things that I suspect will come out of questions, is, well, exactly what do you mean by such and such? But our first goal is, well, we want a system that delivers what I call economic democracy. And that's tricky. One conception of economic democracy would be, well, one person, one vote. How do we decide something? We have one person, one vote. Another version of economic democracy is something Milton Friedman, the proponent of libertarian capitalism, called economic freedom. And that is, well, everybody should be free to do with their person and property whatever they want. That's what economic democracy is. And we think it's important to understand that economic democracy is actually something, it's neither of those. There are some decisions that affect people more or less equally. And then the democratic way to decide them is people would have more or less equal input, decision-making power. There are some decisions that affect really only me. What's the color shirt I'm going to wear this morning? And then I should be able to, I make that decision. I shouldn't have to listen to other people about that. But most economic decisions are neither of those. Most economic decisions affect some people to a greater extent than they affect other people. And what we're shooting for are institutions and economic decision-making processes where people have decision-making power or input in proportion to the degree that they're affected by those decisions. And when you understand that that's what you're shooting for, it has a huge impact on what kind of institutions and decision-making procedures you want to have for different kinds of decisions. So that's one. Call it economic democracy or call it collective economic self-management. The second one is economic justice. And here I'll be very brief. This is something that anti-capitalists have argued over amongst ourselves, since the earliest anti-capitalist movements. Well, what is economic justice? And we think that economic justice is reward according to the sacrifices, according to the efforts and sacrifices that you have made. That if somebody exerts greater effort, if somebody makes greater sacrifices in producing goods and services, then it is just and fair that they would get somewhat greater rewards, greater compensation. But that's very different. It's very different than, oh, well, everybody's awarded simply according to their needs. So that's something that anarchists certainly have argued with and discussed over the years. And it's certainly very different from people are awarded according to the value to society of what their work produces. Even if we don't reward capitalists, you know, for the productive property and the factories they own, it's very different, you know, from rewarding people according to the value to others when they do an hour of work. But in any case, our second goal is economic justice, and we have a position in the traditional leftist argument about, well, what exactly do you mean by economic justice? I also think efficiency is a goal. And I know that most leftists, as soon as they heard the word efficiency, they just want to scream and leave the room. And that's because, for a variety of reasons. One is, if you ask leftists, well, if you have multiple goals or priorities, how high would you list efficiency? Would you list it higher or lower than economic democracy? Would you list it higher or lower than economic justice? They'd say, well, okay, even if I think this is a goal we ought to aspire to, I just don't think it's the be all and the end all that apparently almost every economist thinks it is. And I'm in complete agreement with leftists on that subject. It is only one among goals. On the other hand, I do think it's a goal that's worth achieving. People don't want to work more than they have to get the same amount of goods. That means they don't want their time and energy and sacrifices to go wasted. And when we have scarce raw materials from the natural environment, and we only have a certain amount of machines and capital stock, we don't want to use them in a way that doesn't produce as much social benefit as they can produce. So if you realize that's all that efficiency means, then I think it's a perfectly worthy goal. And I think that if we built an economy that was demonstrably inefficient in those ways, I think that people will become quite resentful, and with good reason. So I do think efficiency is a goal. The other two I would add are something I call solidarity. One possibility is that we organize our economic activities in a way that basically pits people against one another and increases the sort of distrust that people have for one another. Well, another possibility is we could try and organize our economic decision-making procedures and our economy in a way that would increase people's solidarity for one another. And I think that's something that all leftists have always sensed, that we want an economy that generates solidarity rather than undermines. There's precious little solidarity amongst people on the planet right now. Why do we want an economy, which is what capitalism is, that basically goes out of its way to undermine whatever solidarity people have for one another? Why wouldn't we want our economy to do just the opposite? And then finally, I think variety is something that the best life for some people is very different than the best life for other people. So given the variety of people we are, then that almost dictates that we need to afford, we want an economy that generates a variety of different activities and consumption opportunities for people to have. And that's been an Achilles heel of traditional 20th century socialism, and I think that's been widely noted. And I think that's something that we need to take into account seriously. So those would be the goals as I would define them briefly, understanding that there's considerable debate about some of them, particularly the economic justice.
Yes, so just to repeat those, so it's economic democracy or self-management, economic justice, efficiency, solidarity, variety, and of course, sustainability. And I think we all know what that means. So let's move on to the, let's inspect the structure of the participatory economy. So we will discuss it, this in more depth in just a minute, but could you give maybe an elevator pitch
Yes.
on the participatory economy? You know, what are the major aspects? What are the key institutions and social relations in just 1 or 2 minutes?
Okay. Here are the building blocks, the essential features of a participatory economy. The first is social ownership. I'm going to call it the productive commons. And the idea, it belongs to everybody and nobody. That nobody has any more right to benefit from the use of the productive commons than anybody else does. I think that's when I elaborate at some point, I'm going to explain, I think we need an expanded understanding as compared to the 20th century idea that, oh, well, that means the machines in the factories are owned by everybody collectively.
Well, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. But you're about to get kicked out of the. You're about to get kicked out of the elevator. So.
Okay. The second is democratic councils, and in particular, democratic worker councils, so that workplaces would be governed by democratic councils where every person working there has one vote. Ultimately, and I mean, democratic workers' councils are a very common element in almost every libertarian or socialist, vision of a desirable economy. Early socialists, I don't think, paid as much attention to, well, how are consumers going to be organized? And we've proposed that you also want what we call neighborhood consumption councils, because we want to empower consumers along with workers in terms of making the decisions about what's made. So we propose there should be democratic workers' councils and there should be democratic neighborhood consumption councils. And then the other major feature of a participatory economy is what we call a participatory planning procedure. And participatory planning, the easiest thing to do is to explain what it replaces. It replaces markets. So instead of allowing market forces in buying and selling to determine what's going on during the year, we would make an attempt to come up with a plan that coordinates the activities of all the worker councils and the consumer councils before we start the year. So we're going to replace markets, and we're also going to replace central planning or authoritarian planning. We're not going to have a planning ministry that is in charge of coming up with the plan for the year. Instead, we are going to come up with an annual plan through a procedure that we call the participatory annual planning procedure. And it's a procedure that essentially is one where workers' councils propose what they want to produce and what they need to do that. Consumer councils propose what they want to consume. And they also basically provide information about what their income rights are, that the basis of that that are the basis for that consumption. That neighborhood consumer councils propose what they want to consume, worker councils propose what they want to produce, and then we have a procedure whereby we discover that when they make these proposals initially, they won't amount to a feasible plan. But we have proposed procedures that will lead them to revise their proposals until they reach a feasible plan. And the revision will take place where the worker council revises its own proposal. No central planning authority can revise it for them. Consumer councils provide their own proposals, and they collectively are able to make a very quick decision about whether or not they find the proposals of other councils acceptable.
Okay, we'll come back. Okay,
we'll come back to that.
That's a nice short summary. Let's finish the elevator pitch. So, how do people get goods and services, what they need and desire?
I mean, that's not too different from the way it works pretty much anytime, which is, you have an income. You've gone ahead and said, well, this is what I want to consume for the year. You're not tied to it. As the year goes on, you might consume more or less than you had said during the planning process. But essentially, consumers will have incomes and they will go ahead and spend those incomes. If they don't want to spend all their income on what they're consuming during the year, that means they'll build up some savings. If they want to spend more, that means they're going to have to borrow, and we're going to have some sort of credit unions or community credit unions that make decisions about whether or not borrowing is acceptable and credible. So that's not going to look very different than what people are used to.
But the aim is anyway to try to have pay according to effort and sacrifices, which is different.
And our proposal on that, and this is something that's been discussed widely over the past 30 years. Our proposal on that is that worker councils, each worker council should make its own decision about how it wants to evaluate what its members should be paid. That how they go about that, we would leave up to them. Our suggestion is that the fair thing to do is if workers are going to pay one another in their own council differently, if there's going to be any differences, we think that the ethical way to proceed would be if some people are working harder or longer hours, if some people are taking on more difficult tasks or tasks that nobody wants to do, well, then that's the basis for saying, well, that person gets a higher what we used to call effort rating. So your income as a worker is going to be determined by your fellow workmates. And our proposal is that that worker councils should go about deciding how they think that can best be done amongst themselves. But our suggestion is that what we think a socialist political party would be arguing for in such an economy is that the fair way to go about that would be at least roughly to make any differences in people's income or pay based on any differences in efforts or sacrifices that they have made during the year. Now I'll just say that means that in our expectation, the differences in people's income in a participatory economy are going to be minuscule compared to any historic economy. I mean, the differences in effort and sacrifices that people make in work, is much, much smaller than the differences in income, certainly in a capitalist economy, and it would be much, much smaller than the differences in income in any market socialist economy. On the other hand, it's different from every worker just says, well, I need this, and it's automatically approved. And there are some versions of anarchism that believe that, well, it's self-declared needs that should be the basis of consumption.
But that does factor into the participatory economy as well, doesn't it? But it's not all of it.
Yes. So there are clearly cases where there has to be consumption based on need. And so we recognize that. But we do think that part of income distribution should be on the basis of, as judged by your workmates, any differences in efforts and sacrifices people have been made during the year. And then there should be a healthy chunk of income that's based on differences in the needs that people have. And that the income according to need is something that would have to be decided. How generous is that? That has to be decided by our proposal is that would clearly have to be decided by some sort of democratic political process.
Oh, okay, so the division of labor as well is a topic which you and Michael Albert have really devoted a lot of attention to in quite a rare way. And so could you say something about that?
Yes. Yugoslavia had a very interesting experiment that it ran from 1950 up to the mid-1960s. It was just a 15-year period when Yugoslavia had a market socialist economy. They called their economic system worker self-management. And in their workplaces, they had one person, one vote. And what happened over those 15 years was that participation in workplace management got smaller and smaller and smaller. That in the early years, there was fairly active participation at the meetings. It was very vibrant. Everybody was weighing in and discussing different options and as time went on, fewer and fewer people were taking any interest, and you essentially had decisions that were now being made by sort of a very small group. And the small group were the people who had jobs where their job was for them to basically be sitting around and doing analyses and, you know, going to meetings and making decisions. And everybody else was just doing what they were told. So if you take a look at job structure in a workplace, and if a majority of people are just doing rote tasks, if they are just carrying out orders and sort of performing tasks, and performing those tasks in no way provides them information, expertise, or even the habit of thinking about the kinds of decisions that have to be made about running an enterprise, and should we end up doing this or that? Should we change our product line? Should we change the way we're doing things? If your work doesn't in any way prepare you or train you or give you expertise or practice at that, and yet other people, that's all they're doing, well then you're going to have formal economic democracy. Everybody has one vote at the worker council, but it basically becomes kind of a sham.
So what's the participatory economy solution?
Our proposal is that workplaces should try and restructure jobs so that every job has some tasks that what we call empowering. They would tend to empower the person in terms of information and just sort of attitude about, you know, being an active participant in workplace decision making, and that nobody have a job where all of the tasks that they are doing are these empowering tasks, that there are some tasks that are not particularly empowering, and that those should be basically shared amongst everyone. So that is what we've said about, when we call this job structures. We say jobs should be structured so that all jobs have some empowering tasks, and tasks that are really ones that in no way help somebody, make decisions in workplaces, that those tasks should be shared amongst everybody.
And these are balanced jobs. Balanced jobs, yeah.
So we call those balanced jobs. Jobs should be balanced for empowerment. Now, they could also be balanced for desirability, and you could make an argument that that's fair in terms of economic justice. On the other hand, if they're not balanced for desirability, then you can compensate that. You can compensate for that in terms of pay differences. But you can't compensate for unbalanced. If jobs are not balanced for empowerment, at least to a much greater extent than they ever have been in any known economy, then it seems to us that if you're trying to build economic democracy, you're essentially going to find yourself increasingly unable to do that and maintain that.
And political democracy as well. It's about creating citizens, but also the point is that you propose that each workplace, let's say as the default, each workplace will decide this itself. It's not like there's a template that's forced upon workers.
Our proposal. We have a suggestion of what we think is a good idea and why, but our actual proposal is, when it comes down to remuneration or pay, that's up to the workers and the worker council to decide amongst themselves. And I expect different worker councils will go about that very differently. And that would become one reason that when you're applying for a job someplace, when you're picking, where do I want to work? One of the first things you'd want to know is, well, how do they decide on any differences in pay or income? And you'd want to pick one that you feel comfortable with. And similarly, we are proposing and explaining why we think it's important to try and balance jobs for empowerment to a greatest extent as possible. But when you think about it, when you think about different workplaces, how to do that would be so idiosyncratic to particular work situations that it just seems it wouldn't make sense to try and do that from the outside. That would have to be something that's done by the inside, and we're proposing that it be done, but we're saying it's up to individual workers' councils to decide how to do that, or even if to do that.
Yeah, this is the class struggle between the working class and the coordinator class, or people might be more familiar with the term the professional managerial class there from the Ehrenreichs, which we can expect to continue even in a socialist economy. There's something else to say about these to finish up this kind of whirlwind tour, and then we'll come back to the participatory planning procedure, because this is really important. But these councils, these neighborhood councils, which have a consumer function, and worker councils, they don't just act as individual units, though, do they? They do associate with one another, and they do this in a federal structure. Can you say something about that?
Yes. Look, I'm an economist, and economists think about something called public goods. So there are private goods where, shirts and shoes. Then, well, what would you call a neighborhood park? Well, an economist would say, well, that's a public good, but it's a public good only for the residents of the neighborhood. That's who uses the park. What would you call a mass transit system for the city of Boston? Well, that's a public good, and it's a public good that is consumed by all the residents of Boston. So we propose that we have these neighborhood consumer councils, because you can't have individual consumers participating in the annual planning process as individuals. So we group the consumption proposals from the individuals are aggregated into the neighborhood consumption proposal. So we have neighborhood consumption councils and worker councils. Those are who participate in the annual planning process. But we also, who's going to put in proposals for improving the mass transit system in the city of Boston? Well, that would be the federation of all the neighborhood councils in the city of Boston. Or if it's the greater Boston area because the subway goes out to Revere, well, then that's fine, you do that too. There are some goods that are consumed at the level of the state. We have state parks. We have state road systems. And then there are some goods that are consumed at the national level. Of course, the typical example that's always discussed by economists is national defense. It's not that I want to prioritize spending on national defense, but in that case,
it has to be done.
So the question's going to be, well, who is going to participate in the planning process and express people's demands for public goods and consumption? And our answer is, oh, those are those different federations at different levels of consumer councils. And in our view, it's really one of the failures of market systems is there is a very strong bias in market systems. It's much easier in market systems to express your demand for private consumption than it is for public consumption. And we essentially want to eliminate that bias. And so our way of eliminating that bias is during annual planning, federations put in their proposals for public goods at all these different levels every single time that neighborhood consumer councils and worker councils are putting in their proposals. So we're sort of evening the playing field for people in terms of how they go about expressing their demands for public and private goods.
And this is very important in many ways, and certainly if we want to move to a society where we have, as people say, public luxury and private sufficiency, in order to move in a more ecological direction and so forth. But just before we move on to the the participatory planning procedure, can you just say something about the worker federations? Because it's not only these neighborhood consumer councils that federate over geographic areas, it's also worker councils as well.
Yes, you want in the workers' council, for some purposes, you need workers' councils to federate geographically. And for some purposes, you need workers' councils to federate by industry. For instance, one decision is, suppose the demand that's coming in is such that that the production of some particular product needs to expand. Well, one way to do that is to have all the workers' councils that are currently in that industry increase their production. Another way is to add new workers' councils in that industry. Another reason that you need industry federations is, at some point when you get down to the sort of practicality is, well, how do you become a worker council? And one answer is, well, any group of people who want to start up as a worker council are free to do so. We would encourage them to do so. And one of the differences between, notice that you don't have to, come up with capital, in our system to say there's a group of us, maybe we're just coming out of school and we want to start up a worker council. Maybe we are not happy with the worker councils we've been working in because we keep getting outvoted. And everybody else at our worker council wants to keep doing this, and we don't want to do that. So we want to leave and form our own. So you're going to be able to form new worker councils. On the other hand, you have to be sure that these worker councils are credible. You don't want to have them participating in the planning procedure, proposing to do things, and then discover when the year comes around that they can't fulfill, they can't do what they propose to do. That's just going to create a lot of chaos. So industry federations are going to have to play the role of sort of approving applications to be a new worker council in the industry. They would just sort of check and see, have you got people with some experience? Have they got the right educational background? Are you a credible group? Also, they could monitor, have you made proposals during annual planning, and then every year you don't actually do what you said you were going to do? So they would sort of be in a position to monitor that. I mean, we also thought about, well, what if these industry federations are too conservative, and they're like old fuddy-duddies, and they don't let any new enterprises come in? Well, there's a solution to that. You could essentially say, you could say a certain number, that if you apply to the industry federation and they don't approve your application to be a new worker council in that industry, well, then you can go ahead and appeal to to a body that is not, the group of federation, the group of workers councils already doing that. And we could even say, well, we want a certain percentage of those applications to be accepted every year. And we could sort of feel our way toward, are we running into the problem that we're getting crackpots, or have we actually got a nice mix of, new creative thinking that's coming in?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have time to get into it, but there are many important functions which are fulfilled by these worker federations. Like you said, they could be geographic, they could also be sectoral, so you could have chemical, transport, and so on. Lots of different functions. So let's talk about the annual planning procedure, because this is really one of the distinctive features, and it's the engine of the system in many ways. And you gave an outline of it before, but let's just talk about it again to make sure that viewers have a clear view of how this works. So the annual planning procedure, like you said, the function is to replace the market. It's the answer to the classic question, because worker cooperatives have become very popular amongst the left nowadays. But the question is always, well, what did the co-ops do then? How do the co-ops relate to each other? The default is through the market system, and you can end up with a system where you have collective capitalists competing with one another. So it's an alternative to that. So can you explain how this works?
And the historic alternative to that was, there's some sort of central agency that is essentially, even if you have, even in best case central planning, what happens is you might have the enterprises proposing what they want to do, but it's the central planning authority that is presumed to have the information necessary to know whether or not what that proposal is actually efficient and the right thing. And so the central planning agency always is in the position where they'd say, well, okay, we heard what you wanted to do, but now we're going to revise your proposal, and now this is what you're going to be told to do. And you will be judged according to how closely you have come to fulfilling the plan that we gave you. So we're proposing something that is neither of those. And what we propose is every worker council and neighborhood consumer council makes its own proposal. Those proposals are not the first round in the proposals. And I'm gonna get this out there right now. We've now simulated this because one of the questions that was asked for years was, okay, in theory, you're about to describe something, and in theory, it sounds very good. But what if it takes 500 proposals and revisions of proposals to get to an annual plan? Then it's very nice on paper, but it's totally impractical. Well, the question becomes, well, how many proposals and revisions of proposals does it look like it would really take to get to a feasible annual plan? And we've now done some simulation work and published the simulation work. It's in the more technical book, of course, and just the bare results, the description of the simulations and exactly how they were done and what the results are presented in a very, very lengthy chapter in the technical book, and just the summary is. But the summary is, it looks like it takes maybe 6 revisions. Well, that's something you can do in the month of December. So worker councils make proposals that when you combine them all, they are not a feasible plan. At that point, an agency simply adjusts the estimates of the social costs and benefits of the different things.
Well, let's make this a bit more concrete. So in language that would be more understandable. So let's say consumer plans, this is more straightforward. It's effectively what's going to be consumed by, let's say, a family, or it could be a municipality. We won't go into that for the year. Okay, that's straightforward. For worker councils, we could just say this is their business plan for the year. This is what, you and I often talk about furniture factory. So it'd be, what do we in the furniture factory propose to produce? How many chairs, what kinds, and so forth. And what inputs do we intend to use, including labor, to do that? But of course, how does the worker council decide how to form its business plan? It needs prices for all of these things, and they have to come from somewhere. Yeah.
So we call them, we sometimes we call these indicative prices. Sometimes we've called these sort of estimates of social costs of using different inputs, estimates of social benefits of producing different outputs. And of course, what you would begin every annual plan with would be whatever the final estimates and prices were from the previous year. But we've actually done simulations where we just start with an arbitrary set of estimates.
So for example, you mean, if you need timber to make chairs, you're talking about the price of a ton of timber is, whatever, $1,000.
Right.
Yeah. So, and a chair, a dining room chair will sell for, $50 or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the planning procedure is designed so that it will start with an arbitrary set of indicative prices. And 2 things will happen. When the revisions are made, those prices will change. And the way the prices are changed in a very, very simple way. Suppose at the end of the first round, we have a 10% excess demand for lumber. Well, then an agency just increases the price of lumber in the next round. If there's an excess supply of shoes, then the planning agency decreases the price of shoes in the next round. That's all the planning agency has to do. We don't call it a planning agency because then every anarchist on the planet's going to think it's a central planning agency. So we call it this one thing that's very, it's a very unfortunate name. We call it the Iteration Facilitation Board. All it does is adjust the estimates of these prices that are quoted to the worker councils and the consumer councils when they put in their proposals. And when the prices are adjusted in that way, it turns out that it looks like within 6 revisions, we will get to a feasible plan that we could start the year. There's no central planning agency that has exerted any influence whatsoever over what any of these councils do. There's no market that is, where cooperatives are competing against one another, to buy and sell things. And we have an annual plan that we can start the year. Now, is that plan actually going to work out? I mean, aren't there going to have to be adjustments that are made during the year? Yes, but at least we will have an economy that has generated a plan where workers in their own councils have proposed what they want to do, and only they are allowed to revise their proposals. Now, what is a worker council? How are we going to know whether a worker council's proposal is what is socially responsible? Well, as long as the social benefits of what they're producing are as at least as large as the social costs of what they're using to do it, well, then there's no reason for everybody else not to say, we're happy to have you go ahead and do it. And that's something that is immediately apparent, because every proposal that comes from a workers' council, both they and everybody else, every other worker council, can quickly look and see what's the estimate of the social benefits of your proposal, what's the estimate of the social cost. And as long as the first is at least as big as the second, we have no reason not to say go for it. Consumer councils, well, we have an income. We have the income for the whole neighborhood. And as long as the cost to society of producing what that neighborhood has asked for is not greater than the income that they have, well, then there's no reason for them not to go ahead and be granted that. So we've created a system where you don't need a central planner to sit in judgment on whether proposals are acceptable or not acceptable. The councils can actually easily decide for themselves whether their proposals are acceptable or unacceptable. And it's not a market, and it's not an authority that is telling these councils what they have to do. They're basically self-policing. They're making proposals over what they want to do, and the only constraint on them is they have to do something that's socially responsible. For consumers, you can't consume more than your just income would allow you to consume. And for workers' councils, you can't use valuable resources, and not provide a social benefit that's at least at large. That's what social responsibility comes down to. And in our planning procedure, makes it readily apparent to everyone when proposals are socially responsible and when they're not, and therefore they can self-police without the help of without the interference of some sort of central authority that is dictating what councils do.
Yeah, it's trying to achieve both a substantial level of coordination and also a substantial level of autonomy, which is it's at the heart of designing a post-capitalist system or any kind of economy, and it's very difficult. Okay, so that brings us to the hour. I think we did pretty well. It's very difficult to summarize participatory economy concisely because of just how detailed and developed the proposal is, and because we're only barely scratching the surface, and we've been talking about it for an hour, or let's say a little less than that. Now we will move on to questions from the audience. And I will now look at this. So we had a question as well, or I was going to ask you a question about social reproduction or reproductive labor, but maybe we can bring that in after the audience question. So let's take the first question from Elliot Patterson, which is, can you compare and contrast the approaches of a participatory economy and solidarity economy? So I suppose it depends how you define solidarity economy, but
yeah, I mean that's what I was going to say. If you want to give me a little more elaboration on what it is you call a solidarity economy, then it'd be easier for me to answer the question.
Okay, how about say this? Okay, so Elliot, type another question with a bit more detail, what you mean by solidarity economy, and we'll do a different question now, and we'll come back to that. So this question is from DP, and they ask, in what ways does a participatory economy benefit US Indian nations in the United States that isn't available under capitalism? How will it work as a function of US Indian treaty and water rights and the land back movement? It's an interesting question. How would a participatory economy benefit indigenous people?
You know, it's because of the history of the United States, we have a historical backdrop upon which everything here in the United States rests, which is that lands and resources were basically stolen from the indigenous populations by the European immigrants. And that creates a whole situation, as does the institution of slavery in the United States. And I don't want to pretend that a participatory economy addresses those issues. I think those are issues that have to be addressed. And I believe in addressing them, and I believe that they urgently need to be addressed, and I think that's an important social movement. In many ways, there's one aspect of a participatory economy that is actually informed by the indigenous attitude toward land and resources. I mean, for the past 15 years, I've lived in Portland, Oregon in the Northwest, and very familiar with the whole process by which a very vibrant civilization, indigenous civilization in the Northwest, was decimated and dispossessed, really starting only in the early 1800s and very, very rapidly by 1900. And one of the things that happened was that when the indigenous tried to negotiate treaties with the settlers, what the settlers wanted to do was sort of divide up the land. And it didn't make any sense to the indigenous because they moved around from one season to another season. And so what they needed to negotiate was, what they had always negotiated amongst the various tribes was, at what point in the year does one tribe have the fishing right? At this point on the Salmon River. At what point in the year and their attitude toward land and resources was, well, the land and the resources are for all of us to use. And we negotiate the user rights amongst ourselves in a way that works out. I'm sure it didn't always work out peacefully, but that was their system. And when they took that attitude toward negotiating with the white settlers, it never occurred to them that they needed to sort of say, well, this is land that we have to have. So the whole idea of, when I said that all the means of production are commonly owned, they're owned by nobody and owned by everybody, the whole idea is that whatever a people needs to produce their way of life, all of that, whether it be machines in factories, or whether it be fields, or whether it be forests, or whether it be, rivers with salmon in it, whatever it is basically the property of all. And that's very much a part of our participatory planning proposal. So in some ways, I think, have embodied an indigenous attitude toward what is it that people need to produce their way of life. it's the property of all. It doesn't belong to anybody in particular. We don't divide that up into little pieces of plots that people have individual titles to. So that part, I think, is very consistent with an indigenous attitude, which was a very, in some sense, is an affirmation of the healthiness, the essential moral healthiness and sensibility of many indigenous populations here in the United States. But in terms of rectifying the rights of, the wrongs of the past and reparations, et cetera, I just think that's not an issue that the proposal is intended to address.
Yeah, not specifically. I'll just add something quickly. I mean, I suppose you'd say, looking at the preconditions for that kind of anti-colonial struggle, you have to smash the power of the oligarchy, the capital owning, land owning, finance controlling elite, in order to try to wrest some control back. And that, including in the political sphere, because if the political sphere is dominated by capital accumulation and rentier interests, it's hard to see how anything would be achieved which would benefit indigenous people or almost anybody, because that's not profitable. So, I mean, in a general way, a participatory economy moves in that direction through social ownership and these councils and so forth, but it's not specifically addressed towards that. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or we move on to another question.
Well, there's another issue which I haven't talked about, and we do make some suggestions about this. Whether it be, I mean, it can be racial, racial as in indigenous. So there are discriminated against populations. We have populations who have been historically discriminated against. And we also have genders and sexual orientations that have been historically discriminated against. And we've made proposals about, how it is that has to be taken into account. And the same kind of the place in the book where we take it, where we spell it, where we consider some very aggressive proposals in terms of how to rectify and overcome gender discrimination is in the chapter on reproductive labor.
Okay, good. I wanted to ask you about this. So,
and many of those would apply to racial, groups that have been racially discriminated against as well historically. And we are very much in favor of anti-discrimination laws and procedures. We're very much in favor and propose, affirmative action programs, because we don't believe that gender or racial discrimination is just going to go away by itself. And we think that traditionally socialism has basically assumed that. Well, once we eliminate capitalism, well then everybody's a worker, and everybody's going to be treated equally. And there's no reason to believe that. There's just no reason to believe that would be the fact. So in that regard, we've gone ahead and said we think that there need to be special procedures in worker councils. We propose that there should be women's caucuses. There also should be LGBT caucuses, and there should be racial caucuses. And those caucuses should have a degree of autonomy in terms of how they function. And if there's something going on in a workers' council that, let's say, the women's caucus or the Hispanic caucus feels is discriminatory toward them, then they basically should have the right to issue a stay on that policy and demand that it be sort of debated and considered. They should be able to issue a stay. So we want to empower these caucuses of historically discriminated groups, give them the power to object to policies that they feel are discriminatory, issue a temporary stay until it's debated. Now, here's the problem. So after the debate, what if the majority says we don't agree with you? And our proposal is that it shouldn't be allowed to lead. It shouldn't rest there. That if let's say the Women's Caucus feels that the males have just overridden their objection, but without good reason, they should be able to appeal to the Women's Caucus of the Federation that worker council is a member of. And if they convince the Women's Council of the Federation that they have a case, that Women's Council of the Federation should take their case to the Federation at large. Now, in the end, that's just sort of kicking the can up the road. We're just kicking the decision upstairs. But at least you've got a procedure where there's a very elaborate process of carefully examining, whether a practice is discriminatory, rather than just sort of letting it go by a majority vote. So that is something that we would propose, that there should be racial caucuses and gender caucuses in workplaces.
Yeah, there are resonances here with Rojava. Just on one thing, on the water rights issue, for example, that was raised in connection to the Indians in the United States. This ties in what I was saying before, but if you look at water rights, for example, common ownership of water, for example, a resource like that, and it's used for need, it's completely opposed or contradictory to the rapacious capital accumulation in capitalist society. And it's the whole idea that, publicly owned resources, for example, natural resources, they're a free lunch waiting to be privatized by monopolists and rentiers. So if you have that force bearing down on you, and you're an embattled minority like indigenous people or American Indians, you're going to have your back against the wall. So you have to move to a form of social ownership in order to, but of course, there's still going to be the issue of the settler population and the indigenous population. Like you said, Professor Hahnel, that's historically specific, and it's not going to go away just because you enter into a socialist society. Do you want to continue talking about this, or we can move on to a question? There's an interesting question about art. Are you happy to move on, or do you want to keep going?
I think the best way to move on is to sort of just remind people a participatory economy is not a solution to all problems. And I'm very aware of there's a very intense water right battle going on between the indigenous communities in Southern Oregon and the farmer settler community there. And as waterfall and the amount of water in the reservoirs is diminishing, it's become a very desperate situation. And the negotiations over that are incredibly complicated and incredibly difficult. Essentially, the indigenous want the dams to come down so that the fishing is available for them. That's the use that they want. And they actually have some treaties that are giving them power in the courts to win that. And the settler farmers are saying, oh, but then we're basically going to go bankrupt. We can't be irrigating and we can't do that. So participatory economy is not going to settle. It's not going to solve that problem.
Okay. My dog's coming in and out, so sorry for moving around the place. Okay, let's move on to quite a different topic. So that was a very interesting question that we just covered there. So thank you for that. Here's a question submitted by Anonymous. And this is, what about creative work where the artist isn't sure what they'll be producing over the coming year? Should it be assumed that the productivity and demand will more or less be what it was during the previous year? I just want to say, I'm aware that this is a hot topic of discussion among advocates of a participatory economy. And when Peter Bomer visited Ireland and we met, we were talking about this at some length. So take it away.
What did Peter say?
Oh, I'd have to think about that, but he was saying that it would need to be treated with its own distinct approach.
It's an interesting question. I have to say it always comes up, and again, my honest reaction is I'm not really sure I have an answer. I mean, I can sort of think through the issues, which is okay. Artists are working, they're producing things. They're producing things that presumably people like and consume. It's like a service. So whether it's visual art or sculpture or musicians and performances. So these are things, and well, there's going to be a demand for concerts. There's going to be a demand for art. The thing that's distinctive is that this is a case where for a lot of goods, the consumers know, we presume the consumers know what they want. And therefore, you know, unlike central planners who just say, well, we know what you want, we don't need to listen to you, we don't want to do that. But art is something where if you ask the artists whether consumers really know what they want. I mean, one of my sons is a violinist, and he plays classical music. And he now has a job with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And when the Chicago Symphony Orchestra is putting together their program, what they do is, and in this case, it's very dictatorial, it's the conductor. The conductor decides, well, we have an audience and we have our subscribers and we have to give them some things that they like. So we're going to play some Beethoven, we're going to play some Bach. But we, as the artists, want to help build their tastes for some new things they don't know they like yet. And so they mix in a certain amount of sort of new music that might shock the audience a little bit as a learning process. Now, why do they get to decide what the audience? Because they're the musicians, and we recognize in this area they actually have knowledge that they have a special kind of knowledge above and beyond what the consumer has him or herself. And we want them to be able to guide the process some. But in a participatory economy, you really have that same situation, which is, well, are we going to allow a group of artists to get together and we're going to give them resources that are scarce resources, and we're going to give them an income, and they produce nothing that anybody else values or wants? Or they play music that nobody wants to listen to? And my answer is, well, we don't really want to do that. On the other hand, you could imagine what really would happen is the artists would form a worker council, and they would have to take into account some of what some of us do has to be of value to somebody else. But we can, amongst ourselves, essentially have some of us writing music that really isn't appreciated yet. That can be part of what we're allowing to go on. It's just a little, it's a more delicate, nuanced situation, but I think the essential features are the same, which is that if you're using scarce productive resources, then you have to be producing something that somebody wants. But in this situation, it's a more complicated feeling out process of what it is that people want, and you want artists to have a little more say over that. I mean, it's somewhat similar to educational institutions. We have the parents and their kids. And of course, you know, what they want to be going on in the educational institution has to be taken into account. But don't the teachers have some sort of expertise, you know, that in terms of knowing what it is, you know, that the parents should be wanting for their students and the students should be getting? It's easier for us economists to think in areas where, well, consumer knows whether they like apples or pears. It's not the person growing, the person who's working in the orchard isn't the one that needs to decide whether somebody likes apples or pears. We've got the consumer to decide that. There are situations out there where it's a little more complicated.
Let me come in on that and actually bringing in another question. And this is also by Anonymous. So I don't know if this is the same Anonymous or we're dealing with two different Anonymouses here. But anyway, they say, how do you account for
That's
people?
the advantage of being anonymous.
Yeah, well, yeah. There you go. That's a definition of what it means to be anonymous. Okay, so after we've established that, how do you account for people who don't want to engage in productive labor, disabilities, full-time caregiving, etc.? Okay, so can I just say something about that? Because I was actually going to say basic income is all the rage nowadays. Not something that's emphasized by advocates of a participatory economy, but it's certainly in there. You've talked about it. Michael Albert has talked about it. This could be part of how art could be dealt with. Is that if you have a basic income, there is that flexibility. Something that I was saying to Peter Bomer that time is, I know that there is a proposal for a job guarantee, and this is under capitalism, and Professor Bill Mitchell has written some interesting things about this. But anyway, is you could say for artists, let's say painters, that they would get a guaranteed income. So this is different to a basic income for their work. Now, what they would be paid for would be, for example, to give art lessons to, even classes, let's say, a certain number of hours per week, and the rest of the time they could do whatever they want to produce their art. That's one way that you could do it. Another way is that you could municipalize this, or and so on. You could have grants and things like that. I suppose one of the difficulties that I'd raise here is, firstly, what kind of art are we talking about here? I mean, we talk about music, we talk about visual art. They all have different categories, so it's very difficult to say anything in general about this. But one of the difficulties here is that it's very easy to, for example, you could be dealing with bespoke products, and that's difficult to categorize and to fit into the planning procedure, as opposed to, say, chairs. It's easier to say that, this is one instance of a mass-produced dining room chair of category, wooden chair of category, and so forth. But if an artist produces a unique painting, it's more difficult to fit that into the process. I suppose I'm not answering the question there. I'm just explaining why that would be difficult. But
let me say something about basic income.
Yeah.
First of all, I judge proposals for reforms differently than I judge whether something would be a good or a bad idea in a desirable economy. I mean, it may be that something that's a good idea to fight for it may be that it's a good idea to fight for a basic income that is guaranteed to everybody no matter what, in a certain situation, as part of a transition to a desirable economy. And yet we don't have to do that in the desirable economy. It's no longer necessary. Here's another thing I would throw in. I think the answer to whether or not, so here's the situation we want to think of. Somebody is, now we're going to have, there's going to have to be a decision about, what is retirement age? There's going to have to be a decision about, are you disabled? You're not able to work. There's going to have to be a decision about, with retirement and disability, how generous are those benefits? So those are all political decisions. So we're going to assume that that's all taken care of. What if we have somebody who is of working age, who is not disabled, and they just say, I'm not going to work? Are we going to let them starve? Are we going to give them a basic income? How generous is the basic income going to be? In my mind, the answer would clearly depend on how developed the economy is. I mean, you could have a participatory economy in a very undeveloped, unproductive economy. And then their ability to basically carry freeloaders is very limited. So they might say, we're going to have a very, very small, basic income. That's all we can afford. The rest of us aren't doing that well either. On the other hand, if you have a very advanced economy, then, it will be easier to be more generous in terms of a basic income. I think the problem is that if you have a fair economy and somebody says, I just don't want to work, I don't want to put in any effort, I don't want to make any sacrifices, then basically people who are putting in effort and sacrifices have to decide, how do we deal with such an individual?
So, coming back to that question, they mentioned, the second anonymous mentioned full-time caregiving. You dealt with the part about how do you count for people who cannot or don't want to engage in productive labor. Let's just talk about, because I wanted to ask you about reproductive labor, given that Firestorm Books is a feminist bookshop, and that you have a chapter in your latest book, Participatory Economy. It's chapter 6, entitled Reproductive Labor. So could you, we're running out of time here, but could you explain quickly what is reproductive labor, and then what kind of proposals you would make to address that? And this ties in there with that question.
Yeah, let me just start by saying that this is someplace that I have been I've disagreed with Marxism, traditional Marxism, for a long, long time. That and I don't even want to call it reproductive labor. I want to call it reproductive activity. And I would argue that, at least in theory, reproductive activity is every bit as important as producing material goods and services activity, labor activity. I mean, labor is producing goods and services that we need. Reproductive activity is producing, it's conceiving, birthing, caring for, and raising the next generation of human beings. Why isn't that just as important in society as producing the potatoes that we need to eat? So, I make no presumption whatsoever about the relative importance of what I call the reproductive sphere of social life as compared to the economic sphere of social life. And in terms of, now, reproductive activity also generally entails taking on burdens, just as producing goods and services does. And so the question of who should do it and how should they be compensated, should be treated in the same kind of way. And it's clearly the case that women have been compensated far less than they should have been for the burdens they bear in carrying out reproductive activity. The famous case is, well, women have to work 2 jobs. They basically take all the reproductive activity at home after they go to work at a regular job for a capitalist. So, that's one of the things that feminism has done a brilliant job of criticizing and pointing out. So rewarding reproductive activity and labor, I think is just as important as figuring out fair ways to reward, economic activity.
So how could that be done?
Well, there's one other aspect that makes it a little more tricky, though. And that is that sometimes reproductive activity is carried out in workers' councils. Sometimes it's carried out in educational institutions. Sometimes it's carried out in the healthcare system. But sometimes it's just carried out inside a family. And whenever it's carried out in the social institutions, then we can essentially establish procedures for, judging the degree to which it is burdensome and attempting to reward people according to that. when it's carried out inside families, then we don't really have social institutions that sort of guide the process. And it makes it, and therefore we sort of have a special problem. How do you reward somebody? So I think you want to leave it up to parents whether or not their kids start going to daycare at the age of, at the age of 6 months, or no, they keep them at home until they go to kindergarten. Well, then we have a parent at least who's staying home and carrying out reproductive activity, caring for that child and rearing that child. We need to figure out a way of compensating them. And on the other hand, they're not in a workers' council where we get an effort rating for them. So I think you basically have to, you're left with nothing other than establishing sort of a standard of pay. That, because if the parent is staying home, that's relieving the public service that's available if they decided not to use the daycare. Well, then that relieves society of that. And they are substituting something that I think they should have the choice about whether they do it one way or the other way. And we need to compensate them for doing that. So there're going to have to be some sort of standards of pay for stay-at-home parents. Now, you also have the situation, of course, we don't want the woman to always be the stay-at-home parent. And then the question is, well, how do you
redistribute the
yes.
reproductive activity?
And in the book, I cite an example that I'm very familiar with from Cuba, where they wrote a new constitution in Cuba that simply said that men are equally responsible, for childcare as women are. And it didn't change a thing. So, I mean, you can say this is right. On the other hand, that doesn't mean I think there's still a very necessary role for a very active women's movement to battle on that issue. I don't know whether you can simply go in and say, well, I'm sorry. Well, you can certainly be sure that parental leave programs are not structured in a way where it's more advantageous for a male, for the female to take the parental leave than it is for the male. So you can make sure that you haven't set up, perverse incentives that reproduce the tendency, for who it is that does the reproductive labor or the reproductive activity, always ending up being the female. But these are things that are complicated, need to be recognized. And what we've done really in that chapter, as I said before, there are some areas where we're making proposals for the first time. And the reason is we think they need to be discussed. And I mean, I think that the feminist movement and socialist feminism, I think, have done a brilliant job of criticizing the way these things are handled in our present societies. But I think that we also need, besides criticism, there have to be proposals for, well, what would be a good system? And we need to do more thinking along those lines. And that really is the spirit in which we wrote that chapter. Let's throw it out there. Here are some ideas. We're not nearly as committed to these in terms of defending them, as we are to other parts of our proposal that have been vetted for 30 or 40 years, and they've been actively debated. And that whole chapter is one that is out there really for the first time. And it was the product of an article that was co-written with 3 other people.
So I think Ash has returned here to try to prevent us from talking all through the night, and then tomorrow, and then through the night again. So please take over.
That's a socially useful function you need to perform.
Yeah, well, clearly there is a lot to talk about here and uncover as we've been going just over 90 minutes now. So if folks haven't yet, there is everything that's been talked about in much more detail available in the book, A Participatory Economy, out from AK Press. If you haven't picked up a copy yet, I hope you will. It's a great way to support the project, support the ongoing work, and support Firestorm as well. Yeah, so Ferdia, thank you so much for taking the reins tonight, facilitating this conversation, bringing really insightful questions. Thank you to all the audience members who also brought really engaging questions, and certainly Robin, thank you for sharing your insights and your work here. And yeah, we'll hope to see you all down the line somewhere.
I'm very happy to hear about your collective and your work out there. It's really important stuff that you do. If there's any way that we can help you, you should never hesitate to let us know.
That's great. Yeah, let's stay in touch. That sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you.
Goodbye now.
Pleasure.